The early 1960s in Cuba was the start of harsh communism that would overtake their country until this day. Fidel came into power in 1959 as Prime Minister of Cuba, then established his Communist Party in 1961. This is when the U.S. tried to overthrow their government.
The invasion was a failed attempt by the United States to overthrow the communist leader Fidel Castro. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had the CIA train Cuban exiles for 1 year in 1960. The invasion plan was approved by John F. Kennedy. On April 17, 1961, about 1,300 exiles armed with U.S. weaponry landed at the Bahia de Cochinos, also known as the Bay of Pigs. From the start, the exiles had no chance. 149 were killed and 1,189 were captured. The Kennedy administration was extremely...
After the unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the Cuban regime, the U.S. received photographic proof of missiles being built in Cuba in October of 1962. The Kennedy administration demanded the missiles be removed immediately, or else the United States would send in military blockades and invasions to Cuba. Eventually, Khrushchev of Russia would comply to our demands. My grandmother, Graciela Fontella Garcia, was born in Havana, Cuba in 1930. My grandfather was born in Sevilla, Spain in 1924 and moved to Cuba in 1934 when his father died. My grandparents were married in 1948 and had 4 children by 1961. My father was the youngest of 4. While communism was starting to take over in Cuba, my father, aunts, uncle, and grandparents were trying to make it here to the United States, the free world. The Russian communism that began in Cuba in 1961 required the Cubans to give up their basic rights. They would come into their homes and take inventory of everything they had. They were given rationing cards to be able to get their allotment of groceries and everyday supplies. The government was trying to hide what was really going on, and finally, when revealed as communism to the Cubans, they did not like it at all. They wanted to get out. They weren't the only ones. There were approximately 2 million Cubans leaving when this communism began. In fact, years later, my family would see their fellow Cubans they knew in Chicago. Getting papers to come here is a process, one that wouldn't have been completed without the help of my grandfather's cousin, Romeo, who worked in Washington, D.C. Also, my grandmother's sister and her husband came first in 1961, so they were able to help them expedite the papers. My grandmother, along with my dad, aunts, and uncle, had gotten their papers to leave Cuba before my grandfather. My grandmother would not leave without my grandfather, so they waited for 3 more months for all of them to have their papers in July of 1962. When my grandparents were able to move here, my father was about 1 year. My father's oldest sister Maggie was 11 years. His brother Antonio was 5, and youngest sister Maria 4 years old. When they left Cuba, the older kids and adults would have 3 pairs of socks, 3 t-shirts, and 3 pairs of underwear, along with the clothes on their back. My father at the time was a baby, so they were able to bring more for him. Before they left, they could not sell their home in Havana. They had to give their keys over to the government and return all of their rationing cards. They came over by plane in July of 1962. The trip here took 90 minutes, arriving in Miami, Florida. In Miami, they got refugee help from different organizations and immigration that helped them have food, some money, and a place to live. My grandfather was able to get odds and ends jobs to lay carpet and wait tables in Miami. This got them by for a year, then they were ready to move to Tampa, Florida, where they had relatives. When they left Cuba, they left some family behind, so when they got here and were settled, they helped ones that were left behind get their papers as well, and they would all arrive in 1964. My father and his family were in Tampa for about 3 years, moving around more than any family they knew. My grandfather worked for a restaurant, Los Navidades, as a waiter. Depending on his tips, he would make $100 to $125 a month. My grandmother would find work at an embroidery factory. She would need a translator and started off at $1.10 an hour. 3 years later, in 1966, When they left Tampa, my grandmother was well into the embroidery business and would be making up to $2 an hour. When they packed up and left Tampa, they had 2 families' addresses that they knew in Chicago. So when they arrived in Chicago, they asked the police which location would be safer. The police directed them to the safer location, and they stayed there with friends for 2 weeks. Then moved to an apartment where they lived until 1973. In 1973, they purchased their small home, which my grandparents still live in till this day, in Bellwood, Illinois. They had a couple of short-term jobs, but ended up settling. My grandfather worked for Vapor Corporation till he retired in 1989. My grandmother worked as a machine operator for Weiler Food Company for 13 years. My father moved out of the Chicago area after he met my mother, and they had me in 1989. We moved to Nixa, Missouri, and where I have 3 younger sisters, and here we all are today, thanks to my grandparents being brave and making the bold move to the United States when there was turmoil and uncertainty with their lives in Cuba.